Hello, this lecture is Sectional Antagonism, and that is the bitterness between the northern states and southern states before the Civil War. Soon after the Mexican-American War, the United States entered another era of tension with notable bursts of violence. There were important foreign policy decisions, but these were only a minor distraction to the more serious problem of slavery and its expansion in America. The sectional antagonism was real with no apparent solution suitable for all. In the 1850s, the North and South were on a path of terrible conflict. America's land expansion in the 1840s brought with it new challenges. In addition to the dilemma of what lands would support slavery, there was more attention on maintaining a presence in Pacific waters. With America stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, there was the pressing issue to protect water connections with distant American-controlled territory. In 1848, the Senate approved a treaty signed in 2 years earlier in 1846 with New Granada that granted the United States important transit rights in the Panama region in Central America. The British and Americans eyed each other with suspicion over the Isthmus of Panama. In 1850, the Clayton Bullworth Treaty was signed, which stipulated that both parties agreed to cooperate in the building of an Isthmian canal that neither would have exclusive control. The pact was approved by the Senate, but it was an unpopular pact in the eyes of many. Many believed it violated the Monroe Doctrine. It would take decades before the canal was completed, but in the meantime, Americans completed the first transcontinental railway line in 1855. This line in Panama was only 48 miles long, but it connected the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. Americans also began to show greater interest in Asia. Caleb Cushing was appointed the first American commissioner to China in the year 1843. His mission was to secure commercial privileges. He used a combination of the iron hand and the velvet glove to sign the Treaty of Wangzhou in the year 1844, which included a clear statement of extraterritoriality, particularly for laws and justice issues, legal trials for foreigners in special courts of their own nationality. Commerce boomed for the Americans. Interest in Japan meant that in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry opened negotiations with the Japanese. Now, the Japanese over the centuries had maintained a policy of isolation. The following year, a treaty was signed that opened 2 ports for trade. Although the trade concessions to the Americans were modest, it was an important step for American-Japanese relations. Overall, the Americans worked for peace in Asia. According to one historian, quote, "War making and land grabbing were disturbing to both trading and soul saving," end of quote. Missionaries and their supporters were influential enough to make their wants known in Washington. Unlike its isolation and non-entanglement with Europe, the United States favored cooperation and entanglement in Asia. Lacking naval bases in the Far East, it made good sense for the Americans to promote international law and treaty avenues for trade privileges. As for the Atlantic Ocean, the United States debated Cuba's strategic position. Cuba being located at the crossroads of the Caribbean trade routes and potentially bottling up American Gulf ports. American politicians were determined that no country other than Spain would gain control of Cuba. There was the belief that in due time, the island would be under the control of America. Southern politicians looked at Cuba as a possible slave territory. Jefferson Davis, then Secretary of War in Franklin Pierce's administration, argued that the acquisition of Cuba, quote, is essential to our prosperity and security. Many Southerners believed that annexation would prevent another Haitian-type revolution that had occurred 5 decades earlier. Of course, this was mostly the main player there was France and also Britain. In 1848, the United States government inquired about persons in Cuba, but the negative reaction of Spanish public opinion killed any negotiation. In his inaugural address in 1853, President Pierce, who coveted Cuba, asserted that he would not be, quote, controlled by any timid forebodings of evil from Cuba. During the Pierce administration, Pierre Sol, minister to Spain, was sent to Spain on a diplomatic mission. Sol was a hothead and his antics damaged American-Spanish relations. Elected United States Senator from Louisiana, Sol, within weeks of his arrival in Madrid, wounded the French ambassador in a duel. With duels of this era, it was fortunate that handguns were not very accurate. Spain began to enforce shipping regulations that resulted in the 1854 seizure of the American steamer Black Warrior. This was at Havana, and the claim was that Black Warrior was violating port regulations. Further negotiations, particularly a rash attempt to annex Cuba, only demonstrated that President Pierce's foreign policy was a case of blundering and that the Southern pro-slavery expansionists seemed to show no limits in their ambitions. President James Buchanan, who came after Pierce, likewise failed to acquire Cuba. The South-North divide over slavery prevented any successful acquisition of Cuba. With little time to analyze what was happening, much less to propose long-range solutions, emotion seemed to replace reason as the slave debate grew loud and acrimonious in America. At stake was the future of the nation itself. Radical abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison were seen by some as a threat to the Union. Their efforts, that is the abolitionists, were treasonous in the eyes of some. There was the concern that abolitionism would initiate a destructive war. Distrust mounted even when some abolitionists entertained the idea of the North's succession from the Union. Northerners, on the other hand, viewed Southern politicians as a greater threat to the nation. Many Northerners had become convinced that the expansion of slavery was not simply the self-determination to preserve their peculiar institution. They believed it threatened the nation's democratic foundation. If an expanded slave society gave the South permanent control of the federal government, they believed the result would be economic stagnation, unemployment, and financial ruin. Northerners could point to Southern intellectuals such as George Fitzhugh, who opposed capitalism, seeing it as inferior to a slave-based economy. The South accepted the legality of slavery and the superiority of the Southern way of life. The Democratic Party was powerful, and its support for slavery gave Southerners a boost. The winning formula of the Democratic Party since the election of 1828 was to elect the president of its choosing, hold the South together, and pick up some support in the North. The Democratic Party was in a good position to appoint Supreme Court judges agreeable to the Southern way. By combining their power in the Democratic Party, which often controlled both Congress and the White House, with their supporters on the Supreme Court, the slave states enjoyed many political successes. In 1849, there were 15 slave and 15 free states, and any new states jeopardized this balance. The following year, politicians hammered out an important compromise, but it was defeated. Kentucky's Henry Clay was a key political figure stretching back from the immediate period after the War of 1812 all the way up to 1850. He had many political skills and plenty of energy. He owned slaves, but he called slavery a great evil. The Compromise of 1850, presented by Clay, was an ominous bill with 5 separate provisions. 1, California enters the Union as a free state. 2, New Mexico gets a territorial government without any mention of slavery. 3, the federal government assumes Texas' outstanding debts, and in return, Texas limits its western boundary. 4, slavery continues, but not the slave trade. And 5, Congress adopts a new fugitive slave law. There were 6 months of debate, but the ominous bill failed to get the necessary votes. However, it passed when it was broken down in sections and supported by both Southern and Northern congressmen. Still, there was not much enthusiasm overall for the arrangement. The key features were California's entrance as a free state, the creation of territorial governments that were open to slavery by principle of popular sovereignty, and a new fugitive slave law. The legislation bought the nation some time, and it kept the Democratic Party united and strong. But the fugitive slave law aroused the passions of many Northerners. The new slave law targeted suspected runaway slaves. It pretty much deprived them of any rights. A slave owner could simply submit an affidavit to a federal commissioner, and an accused runaway slave would be put in jail and not receive trial by jury. For whites, the worst component of the fugitive slave law was that it made every American a potential slave catcher, because the law stipulated that private citizens had to assist federal authorities in the capture of runaway slaves. If private citizens did not cooperate in the capture of a slave, they faced either a fine or prison. Some Americans refused to comply with the state. Years earlier, there were a few northern states that passed legislation for a fairer process for dealing with fugitive slaves. But the Supreme Court, in essence, doing the bidding of the Democratic Party, ruled against any state laws that interfered with the process of capturing slaves. In an 1842 case concerning Pennsylvania, the US Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to have state laws that hindered the return of fugitive slaves. Justice Joseph Story asserted, quote, "We have not the slightest hesitation in holding that under and in virtue of the Constitution, the owner of a slave is clothed with entire authority in every state in the Union to seize and recapture his slave whenever he can do it without any breach of the peace or any illegal violence." In this sense, and to this extent, this clause of the Constitution may properly be said to execute itself and to require no aid from legislation, state or national. End of quote. Well, in response to the fugitive slave state of 1850, more northern legislatures passed personal liberty laws. These laws made it a crime for state officials to assist slave owners and federal authorities in recovering fugitives. Southern politicians were outraged by this action by northern states, but there was an interesting irony to their reaction. As one historian explains, by demanding a stronger federal law and denouncing northern states' efforts to nullify a locally distasteful measure, Southerners were implicitly repudiating their state rights position. Another explosive issue concerning territories becoming states. Owned and governed by Congress, sparsely populated territories were a temporary arrangement. Nobody wanted territories to remain territories forever, and Congress supported a two-stage process for bringing territories into statehood. In the first stage, Congress appointed a governor and opened a land office where people acquired land, but no voting rights, since there was no self-government. When the territory became more populated, there was the need for self-government and a constitution. When Congress approved the Constitution, the territory became a state. The territory to state arrangement was acceptable providing there was a balance of free and slave states. When the United States gained the New Mexico and Utah territories, political passions rose. American leaders saw popular sovereignty as a solution to deal with the issue of statehood. Politicians decided that it was undemocratic for Congress to tell the people of a territory thousands of miles away how they should govern. They believed it was better to let voters of the new state decide on the issue of slavery. The issue became more complicated as politicians fought over where the transcontinental railway should go. Democrat Senator Stephen Douglas pushed for the building of a transcontinental railway, but it could not be built through unorganized territory. Douglas called for the organization of the Kansas and Nebraska territories, partly to get Southern votes for the territorial organization, and partly because he believed that slavery would not survive in the Northern territories. Douglas agreed to back a bill invalidating the Missouri Compromise line. Now, Douglas was from the North, but he was also a Democrat. Following through with popular sovereignty, voters within each territory would decide whether slavery would be allowed or prohibited. The issue of slavery in the territories reared its ugly head. The passing of the Kansas-Nebraska bill passed because of the support of Southern Democrats. Could the powerful Democratic Party be stopped? Well, a new political party would try. The Republican Party announced that, quote, "No man can own another man," end of quote. And the Republican Party would not permit slavery in the territories or the new states. The Republican Party consisted of former Whigs, Know-Nothings, and Free Soilers. Named after the traditional English party, the Whigs had coalesced in opposition to the Jacksonian Democrats 2 decades earlier. The Whig Party declined in the 1840s, in the late 1840s, with many supporters going to the American Party, also known as the Know-Nothing Party. The American Party was short-lived because it lacked political experience. That is, the candidates, the supporters of the leaders of the party lacked political experience, and they also lacked wisdom. And voters found its hard stand against non-natives, that is, foreigners and Catholics, offensive. The Free Soil movement began in 1846 when others supported Congressman David Wilmot's proposal of banning slavery in any territory that might be acquired from Mexico in the future. The new Republican Party clearly favored Northern thinking, but its political influence was initially modest. What happened in Nebraska and Kansas would depend on actions at the local level. Because the Kansas-Nebraska Act upheld popular sovereignty, both Northerners and Southerners competed to tip the balance in each group's favor. Nebraska went free, but it did not look promising that there would be enough votes for a free Kansas. Settlers from the North landed in Kansas, but on election day in 1855, nearby Missourians flooded across the border to vote in support of the pro-slavery candidates for the territorial legislature. The Southerners were victorious and they took control of the government in Lecompton. Lacking good judgment, they passed laws forbidding opponents of slavery to serve on juries or to hold political office. A more chilling law was the death penalty for any person who assisted a fugitive slave. Anti-slavery Kansans responded by establishing a rival government, writing their own constitution. And so we see a showdown on the horizon. A showdown was inevitable. On May 21st, 1856, slave state supporters marched into the Free Soil stronghold of Lawrence, Kansas, and destroyed printing presses, and they burned a hotel to the ground. The following day, back in Washington, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina searched out Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. Sumner had recently delivered a series of bitter speeches against slavery and Southern politicians, particularly South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler, a relative of Brooks. Defending the honor of his family and his state, Butler struck Sumner repeatedly on the head with a cane. Sumner was trapped in his Senate desk, screwed to the floor. The assault was so serious that he could not return to his seat for 2.5 years. And the empty seat became a symbol in the North of Southern brutality. In the South, the incident became a symbol of the only sort of response the so-called arrogant North would respect. Brooks received dozens of new canes from supporters across the South. In the next day, back in Kansas, a Free Soil immigrant named John Brown, hearing of the burnt hotel in Lawrence, sought revenge, and he murdered 5 pro-slavery men. This became known as the Potawatomi Massacre, and Kansas itself became known as Bleeding Kansas. John Brown struck again 3 years later when he assembled men and munitions and planned an assault on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He hoped to gain weapons and initiate a slave rebellion against slaveholders. In October, the Brown Party seized the arsenal and waited for word to spread among the slaves of Virginia that their day of liberation had come. The word spread, but mostly among the whites, who surrounded, killed, and captured Brown and his accomplices. Brown himself actually survived, but he was executed 1 month later. An increasing number of Northerners were frustrated because the South appeared to be supported by the courts and governing politicians. The pro-slavery Democrat Party had controlled the White House since James Polk, and it was Democratic President James Buchanan who endorsed a terrible decision on a Missouri slave seeking freedom while living in a free state. The slave, named Dred Scott, sued for his freedom when his master died while they were both residing in the free states of Illinois and Wisconsin. Scott won his freedom in a circuit court, but in Dred Scott versus Sanford, the Supreme Court in 1857 ruled that Scott, in essence, was not a citizen because he was Black. Moreover, the court concluded that Congress possessed no authority to pass a law depriving persons of their slave property in the territories. So the court more or less argued that the Missouri Compromise had always been unconstitutional. And the Chief Justice was Roger Taney. Many in the North were incredibly upset with the decision. They were aghast. If the Dred Scott decision was followed to its logical conclusion, some northern Republicans warned the United States would reopen the slave trade with Africa and even extend slavery into northern states where it had been banned. The pro-slavery Democratic Party continued to be powerful, but the Republican Party gained strength. In the 1856 presidential election, Republican John Fremont had won 114 electoral votes to James Buchanan's 174. And one can see from the electoral map that the Democrat Party had all the South wrapped up, including some of the border northern states. But the Republicans were on the scene and they were beginning to make inroads. And we can see the popular votes going 45% to the Democrats led by Buchanan, and the Republican picked up 33. There was a third party that garnered approximately 22% of the vote, and that was Fillmore, representing the American Know Nothing / Whig Party. Well, 4 years later, the Republicans were victorious, and Abraham Lincoln became president. Now, he only won 40% of the popular vote, but the Democrat vote was split. The Southern Democrat Breckinridge, he successfully won the Deep South, but there also was other parties. There was a Northern Democrat representative, Douglas. He actually didn't do all that well. So the Democrat Party pretty much are for have slavery issue wrapped up. But there was also the another party, the Constitutional Union, and it also took a bite out of the various campaigns. So the Democratic Party had split, and both the North and South selected their own candidates, and it was the pro-slavery Democrat John Breckinridge who won most for the Democrats. In Southern eyes, the North had arrogantly placed its own interests above those of the Union, insisting on electing a man who made no effort to win a single vote in the South. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, could not be supported. There's no way the Southern pro-slave people could possibly support Lincoln. Well, to conclude, something had to change. The evil ways of slavery could not continue. Secession was suddenly a looming reality. Thank you.